June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers cross into Soviet territory. Within hours, thousands of tanks roll across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. What follows isn't just another chapter of World War II. It's the largest armored conflict in human history, a 4-year apocalypse of steel, fire, and industrial warfare that will consume more tanks than all other theaters of war combined. And here is what most people do and understand. This wasn't won by superior tactics or brilliant generals. It was won in factories, by welders, miners, and assembly line workers who never fired a shot. The Eastern Front wasn't a war. It was a meat grinder powered by diesel engines and measured in the tonnage of steel you could throw at the enemy. Between 1941 and 1945, Germany and the Soviet Union turned Eastern Europe into history's deadliest proving ground for armored warfare. Cities became graveyards, fields became scrap heaps, and the tank, once seen as a supporting weapon, became the centerpiece of total war. But here is the thing that makes this story so different from what you have seen in movies. This war wasn't decided by German engineering genius or Soviet numerical superiority alone. It was decided by something far more mundane and far more terrifying: the ability to replace what you lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. To understand how the Eastern Front was won, you have to understand that this was the first truly industrial war, and in an industrial war, the factory floor is just as important as the battlefield. Let's go back to that morning in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union catches Stalin completely off guard. 3 million German troops supported by 3,600 tanks smash through Soviet defenses. The initial assault is devastating. In the first weeks, entire Soviet armies are encircled and destroyed. Tank divisions evaporate. Now here is where you'd expect me to tell you that German Panzers were technologically superior, and that's why they won these early battles. And yes, German crews were better trained. German tactics were more refined. But the real story is more complicated. The Soviet Union in 1941 actually had more tanks than Germany, significantly more. They had around 24,000 tanks. The problem? Most were obsolete, poorly maintained, spread out. Soviet tank crews often had less than 10 hours of training. Communication equipment barely worked. Tanks broke down before they even reached the battlefield. But here's the detail that changes everything. Even in those first catastrophic months, the Soviets were already producing the T-34. The T-34 wasn't the most powerful tank in 1941. It wasn't the most heavily armored. But it had something that would prove more valuable than either of those things. It was relatively simple to build, reliable enough to operate in Russian winters, and effective enough to kill German tanks. It had slopped armor that could deflect shells, a 76mm gun that could penetrate German armor at range, and wide tracks that let it move through mud and snow that would bog down German panzers. The Germans knew they had a problem the first time they encountered T-34s in combat. General Ewald von Kleist would later call it the finest tank in the world. But in late 1941, the Wehrmacht kept advancing anyway. Why? Because the Soviets were losing tanks faster than they could replace them. Or so it seemed. Here's where the story gets wild. While German tanks are pushing toward Moscow, something extraordinary is happening deep inside the Soviet Union. Entire factories are being dismantled. I mean, entire industrial complexes, machinery, workers, tools, raw materials, everything. They're being loaded onto trains and shipped east, beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. Over 1,500 factories were relocated. Imagine that. As the Germans advance, the Soviets are literally moving their industrial capacity piece by piece to safety. And then, in the middle of winter, often in open fields with no roofs or walls, these factories start producing again. Workers are building tanks in sub-zero temperatures. Women and teenagers who'd never seen a factory floor before are now welding armor plates and assembling engines. The Soviet Union turns itself into a tank-producing machine. By 1942, Soviet factories are churning out T-34s at a rate Germany can't match. They're simplifying production, cutting corners, removing anything that isn't essential to making the tank run and fight. Paint jobs? Forget it. Comfort for the crew? Not a priority. The goal is singular: produce more tanks than the enemy can destroy. Meanwhile, Germany is going in the opposite direction. They're obsessed with quality over quantity. They are designing the Tiger I, a 56-ton monster with armor so thick it is nearly impervious to most Soviet guns, and an 88mm cannon that can destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a kilometer. It's an engineering masterpiece. It's also a production nightmare. Germany produces 1,347 Tiger tanks during the entire war. In 1943 alone, the Soviet Union produces over 15,000 T-34s. Let that sink in. The Germans are building Tigers. The Soviets are building an ocean of T-34s, and in a war of attrition, the ocean wins. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk. If you want to understand the Eastern Front, you have to understand Kursk, because Kursk is where the industrial mathematics of this war become undeniable. The Germans know they're losing the production race, so they decide to bet everything on one massive offensive. They'll concentrate their best tanks, Tigers, the new Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, and smash through Soviet lines in a decisive blow. It's the largest tank battle in history, nearly 6,000 tanks and assault guns collide in the fields around Kursk. The Germans have technological superiority. A single Tiger can destroy multiple T-34s before being knocked out. But here's what the Germans discover: it doesn't matter. The Soviets have so many tanks that they can afford to lose 3 or 4 T-34s for every German tank destroyed. And they do. There's a moment in the battle where German tankers are reporting kill after kill, knocking out Soviet tanks at remarkable rates, and yet the T-34s just keep coming. Waves of them. It's like fighting the tide. One German tank commander described it as trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. You destroy one Soviet tank, 2 more appear, you knock out a dozen, and 20 replace them. The Germans are winning the tactical exchanges and losing the strategic war simultaneously. And then the Panthers start breaking down. These brand new tanks, rushed into production to counter the T-34, are mechanically unreliable. They overheat, transmissions fail. For every Panther knocked out by Soviet fire, another breaks down due to mechanical failure. The Tiger I is more reliable, but there aren't enough of them. After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the German offensive collapses. They've lost hundreds of tanks they cannot replace. The Soviets have lost far more, but their factories are already producing the replacements. From this point on, Germany is on the defensive, forever. Let's pause the strategic overview for a moment and talk about what this actually meant for the people inside these machines. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front was utterly horrific. When a tank was hit, it often caught fire immediately. Crews called them coffins for a reason. If you were lucky, you had seconds to bail out before the ammunition cooked off and the entire tank became a crematorium. The survival rate for tank crews was appalling on both sides. Soviet tankers often went into battle knowing they probably wouldn't survive the day. The average lifespan of a T-34 crew in combat was measured in weeks, sometimes days, but they kept climbing into those tanks because they were defending their homeland from an invader who was burning their cities and murdering their people. German tank crews, particularly later in the war, faced similar odds. Even in superior tanks like the Tiger, they were overwhelmed by numbers. You could be the best tank crew in the world. But when you're facing 10 enemy tanks and you're down to your last shells, skill only takes you so far. And here is a detail that haunts me. Soviet factories were producing tanks so quickly that sometimes they didn't even bother painting them. Fresh T-34s would roll off the assembly line in bare metal and drive directly to the front. Some of them would be destroyed within hours of being completed. The crews inside barely trained, the tanks barely finished, thrown into a war machine that consumed steel and human lives at an unimaginable rate. This is what industrial warfare looks like. It's not romantic. It's not about honor or glory. It's about production capacity and replacement rates and the cold mathematics of attrition. As the war grinds on, both sides adapt. The Soviets, never content to just produce the same tank forever, start upgrading the T-34 in 1944. They introduced the T-34-85 with a larger 85mm gun capable of fighting German Panthers and Tigers on more equal terms. They also introduced the to the Iosif Stalin to a heavy tank with a massive 122mm gun. This thing is designed specifically to fight German heavy tanks and to smash through fortified positions. When NS-2 fires, the concussion can knock nearby infantry off their feet. It's a monster, and it symbolizes how the Soviets have transformed from a nation desperately trying to survive to one that is now dictating the terms of armored warfare. Germany, meanwhile, is spiraling into desperation and delusion. They keep designing heavier and more complex tanks. After the Panther and Tiger I comes the Tiger, to even bigger, even heavier, even more complex. It's an incredible machine in theory. In practice, it's a maintenance nightmare that Germany can barely produce and can't fuel. By late 1944, German tank production is collapsing. Allied bombing is destroying factories. Resources are scarce. Skilled workers have been drafted into combat units or killed. The tanks that do get produced often can't reach the front lines because there's no fuel. The Soviets, by contrast, have hit their stride. They're producing tanks at peak efficiency. Their crews are experienced, their tactics have evolved, and they have millions of men being mobilized to push west. By 1945, the Red Army is rolling toward Berlin with unstoppable momentum. They have overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and manpower. German resistance is fierce but futile. Here's the thing about industrial warfare. Once one side achieves a decisive advantage in production, it's almost impossible to reverse. Germany could have had the best tanks in the world, and arguably they did, but it didn't matter. They couldn't build enough of them. They couldn't maintain them. They couldn't fuel them. They couldn't replace them. The final Soviet assault on Berlin involves thousands of tanks. The Germans have a few dozen operational tanks left, supplemented by whatever they can scrape together. It's not a battle. It's an execution. When Germany surrenders in May 1945, the Eastern Front has consumed an estimated 44,000 to 70,000 tanks, more than all other theaters of World War II combined. The exact number will never be known because record-keeping collapsed along with the armies themselves. So what does this all mean? Why does the tank war on the Eastern Front matter beyond just being a historical footnote about which tanks fought which battles? Because the Eastern Front proved something that changed warfare forever. In modern industrial war, technological sophistication means nothing if you can't mass produce it. Germany had better tanks, better tactics, better training in the early years, and they lost because they couldn't sustain production. The T-34 wasn't the best tank of World War II by most technical measures. But it was good enough, simple enough, and producible enough to win. That's a lesson that echoes through every conflict since. The best weapon isn't the most advanced one. It's the one you can build, maintain, and field in numbers large enough to overwhelm the enemy. This was the war that revealed the true face of 20th century conflict. Not knights in armor having honorable duels, but factories grinding out machines faster than the enemy can destroy them. Victory went to the nation that could turn its entire economy into a weapon, and there's something deeply disturbing about that. The Eastern Front tank war reduced human beings to interchangeable parts in a production equation. Soviet tankers were trained just enough to operate the machine and then sent to their deaths because replacing them was easier than keeping them alive. German tankers were given magnificent machines that couldn't be replaced and told to hold back an avalanche. Both sides treated their tank crews as expendable components in an industrial process, and that's what modern warfare had become. The tank war on the Eastern Front wasn't won by heroes or genius commanders or technological marvels, though all of those existed. It was won by millions of workers who never saw the battlefield, who wielded wrenches instead of rifles, who built T-34s in factories beyond the Urals while German bombs fell on their former homes. It was won by Soviet women melting down church bells to make tank armor, by teenage workers sleeping on factory floors between shifts, by engineers who simplified production processes to shave minutes off assembly times. Because those minutes multiplied across thousands of tanks could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The Germans built Tigers, magnificent, terrifying, deadly. The Soviets built a flood, and the flood drowned everything in its path. When you look at those old photographs of Berlin in May 1945, rubble and ruins and Soviet tanks rolling through streets choked with debris, you are seeing the end result of an industrial equation that was solved 3 years earlier in those relocated factories beyond the Urals. The war was decided the moment Soviet production exceeded German losses. Everything after that was just the working out of industrial mathematics written in steel and blood. That's the real lesson of the Eastern Front tank war. Not that one side was braver or smarter or more determined, but that in modern warfare, victory goes to whoever can turn their nation into a more efficient killing machine. It's a cold, brutal truth, but it's the truth that shaped the 20th century. And if that doesn't make you think differently about war, I don't know what will.